Hello, everybody. Welcome to Monday's ELNET's Monday briefing. We have a terrific discussion today with an exemplary speaker. So I'm going to dispense with the update and a prologue and jump right to it. If you're not familiar with Andrew Fox, you should be. If you're not following him on Twitter, if you've not joined his Substack, you should. He provides just terrific commentary on all the things we care most about on this call. He's a real friend of ELNET's. He has joined multiple ELNET delegations, both as a participant and a co-leader. We decided last week on short notice to change the direction of today's briefing, and we thought Andrew would be the perfect guest. So when I reached out to him on short notice, he obliged and said, for ELNET anything, which means a lot to us. And above all, Andrew is an indefatigable and formidable advocate for Israel on the international stage. Major Andrew Fox served as an officer in the British Army from 2005 to 2021. He left as a major in the Parachute Regiment. He served in operations in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. He has degrees in law and politics, war studies and psychology. He was a lecturer in behavioral science, which is one of my favorite fields of study, at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and he's now a think tank research fellow in Westminster, specializing in the Middle East, defense, and disinformation. Andrew, it's thrilling to have you back. Thank you again for joining ELNET.
Great to be here. Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.
So you've written a lot these last couple of weeks. We have a lot of complex, I think, topics to discuss, but I want to jump into something that is probably a little bit easier, and that is the shakeup in Keir Starmer's cabinet. David Lammy is out as UK Foreign Secretary. He'll become Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Minister, and he'll be replaced by Yvette Cooper. I've done a little reading on Yvette. There's not a lot to understand about her relationship with Israel, other than she proscribed, or was one of the leading proponents of prescribing Palestinian Action as a terrorist organization. What could you tell us about the shakeup? What does it mean? And who's Yvette Cooper?
Look, the Labour government here have been struggling. They came in last year with a huge majority in the House of Commons, which normally would guarantee you a pretty smooth ride for the duration of your parliamentary term. But Labour, I think, have been rocked in the polls. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is now recording some record lows in terms of approval rating. Economically, the UK is not doing particularly well. And then, of course, there is huge uprest here about immigration and the siege that's coming over the English Channel in the small boats. They've been reaching record numbers under Labour. Potentially not the biggest issue in the grand scheme of things, but the optics suggest that Labour aren't all over their mandates. And so this is what Keir Starmer is calling phase two of his prime ministership. And he's trying to shake things up in order to, I think, try and reclaim the narrative from Reform, who is the up and coming party. They've only got 5 members of parliament at the moment, but they are overwhelmingly in the lead in the polls in the UK. At a canter, they would look like they might be getting elected if the polls stay where they are. And Starmer is trying to buttress the Labour vote against that. Now, on the other hand, Labour are having to balance the kind of Palestinian left-wing kind of nexus that we've got here that seems to be taking votes away from Labour on the other side. So on the kind of hard left, they're now drifting off to the Green Party and Jeremy Corbyn's new party whenever he decides what it's called and what it's going to stand for. So Labour are in a rock and a hard place at the moment. I think Lammy was particularly weak on Israel. Refunding UNRWA, dropping opposition to the ICC cases against Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu, giving sanctions against Ben Gvir and Smotrich. That we have not been a good ally to Israel in the UK for the last year or so. Yvette Cooper, I think, certainly has her head screwed on right when it comes to things like Palestine Action. But my overall analysis, I would say, is that this isn't going to make a huge amount of difference to the direction of travel for the Labour Party. It feels far more cosmetic than it does meaningful. So I'd be very surprised if there are any huge changes in policy. The focus is going to be on immigration, and we'll see how that goes.
So, before we opened it up to everybody, you and Larry were discussing the 70,000 protest yesterday or march yesterday. Um, Recently, a report was done by, let me think, it was Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, commissioned a YouGov poll. That YouGov poll found 1 in 5 Britons hold anti-Semitic views, and 45% believe Israel treats Palestinians like Nazis treated Jews. Since you are a disinformation expert, and later on we're going to get into some of the issues about information, but what are your do you think this is a systemic and perhaps long-lasting change in the UK's sentiments towards Jews and Israelis, or do you get the sense this will shift when information shifts and perhaps the Gaza war comes to some conclusion?
Yeah, I think there's a chance of shifting it once Israel's not in the headlines every day. And the bigger issue is, of course, that those headlines are so skewed, they're so biased, they're so captured by the Hamas narrative that fair reporting has long gone out of the window. And I'm sure you've seen that in the United States as well as
Mhm.
we see it in Europe and the UK. Um, the This is undeniably a challenging time for British Jews. I was at the march yesterday. It was fantastic to see so many people turn out. Um, and to see such representation from at least two of our political parties. Of course, Labour didn't send anyone from the government to actually talk to or even show solidarity with the campaign, which I think says something, of itself. Um, but the fact that 70,000 people will turn out is a great thing, and they can't all have been Jewish because, frankly, there aren't that many Jewish people in the UK. It's a very, very small population, and there were certainly plenty of people like me who feel particularly passionate about this and think that what we're seeing against Jews and Israel is actually not just an attack on those two things, it's an attack on the values of the West. It's no coincidence that the slightly more extreme Islamic groups and the slightly more extreme far left have coalesced together to form this, what they call the Red-Green Alliance. We're seeing that
Mhm.
in the United States as well. My friend Azra Nomani has done some incredible work on that, and her book on it I would highly recommend to you. Um, so it's not a new thing. It's not I don't think it's an irredeemable thing, but it is certainly a high profile thing right now. And I don't think it's going to be possible to kind of start making a recovery from it until the Gaza war is out of the headlines.
I had the pleasure of meeting Azra a couple of years ago. She's a very courageous woman and has done
Mm.
remarkable things here in the United States. And I would agree. I think fundamentally these pro Hamas, pro Palestinian rallies are fundamentally more anti-West and are just using the Israel as a cudgel to pummel the West right now. So I would agree with you on that on both fronts there. So let's switch a little bit. Let's go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I read your commentary on that. I thought it was really quite interesting. For those who aren't familiar, Xi Jinping held a summit I think it was still held in Shanghai, just, hence the
Tianjin.
name. Oh, Shenzhen. Okay, the
Mm.
name is the Shanghai Cooperation. If it were a DC comic book, it would be the Hall of Doom. I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. Could you explain to everybody what you meant by it is, quote, a bloc that roars in communiques but rarely bites in policy? What did you mean by that? What's the history of it, and what's different this time, do you think, with the SEO?
So it came about in, I think, 2001, where China were trying to, expand their soft power influence in their backyard, and it's now expanded to, as you say, a who's who of all the worst countries in the world. Uh, what it doesn't have, though, is any real kind of policy making power. It's not like the European Union that can make legislation. It's not like the federal government in Washington that can make laws for the whole United States. It's a talking shop at the end of the day. Look, you've got Pakistan and India both going to this. They're never going to agree on certain things. China and India are in a border dispute. A variety of other countries certainly have tensions with other members. So the idea that they will get, diplomatic unity to make serious policy decisions, I think, is a remote one for now. But what it is optics. And I think globally, we're moving into an era of great power competition once more. It's going to be typified by the United States and China. They're the two superpowers. Uh, and we saw that Chinese military display, which I think should raise eyebrows. It's not quite as impressive as they made out, but it's certainly, in terms of mass, very impressive. They do lack the ability to project their force particularly far beyond China's borders. And of course, China has its non-intervention policy when it comes to foreign conflicts. So it's not quite as terrifying as, if you were the enemy of the United States with a carrier group in every ocean. It's not that bad. But it does optically show things like Iran is not as isolated as we would hope they would be. Russia is not facing total isolation from its monstrous and appalling campaign in Ukraine. And I was on the front lines in Ukraine just 2 weeks ago, and I saw the sheer evil that Russia is perpetrating there firsthand. That they have allies still. And China, of course, is showing in this era of great power competition that it can bring people to its own table just as well as Washington can when they get European leaders coming to visit. So it's not so much a policy or a defensive cooperation, but it is sending a very strong signal from Beijing to Washington that China has muscles that it can flex on the diplomatic side of life.
So let's expand some of these concerns out to the ancillary parties, because it's the United States versus China, it's the United States and Europe versus China, Russia, China, Russia predominantly. But I'm going to start with a quote, and we'll weigh in after that. So you wrote, "The SCO may never fight China's wars, but it ensures Beijing will never stand alone. That reason, more than anything else, is why this summit matters, not just for Taiwan, but for Israel, for Ukraine, and for anyone who still fantasizes about the American-led order, that the American-led order was permanent." So where is Europe in this? And what's their views of the SCO?
Well, Europe's preoccupation right now is quite understandably Ukraine. That's on our borders. Russia pose a threat not only to Ukraine but also to the Baltic countries, which are in NATO. Europe has its own entanglements with Russia that actually Mr. Trump has called them on, and I do support him on that. I don't agree with his stance on Ukraine on very much, but I do agree that the idea that we're trying to fund and arm Ukraine at the same time as buying Russian petrochemicals is deeply hypocritical, and that does need calling out. So that's a tick in the box for Mr. Trump for me. Europe is as vulnerable to Chinese cyber attacks, to Chinese trade leverage as anyone else in the world is. And so, whilst it's not on our doorstep, certainly Russia's involvement will have raised eyebrows. Not to mention, of course, we know that Iran still, whilst its nuclear facilities are damaged, certainly has malign intentions towards not only Israel, but also Europe and the United States. So we'll be keeping an eye on how these actors are interacting. Chinese money, of course, is well documented to have gone into Iran. It's certainly going into Russia. So it's the nexus that opposes us, and it's something that we have to monitor and keep an eye on.
And is NATO an equivalent comparison? It doesn't sound like it is, but NATO seems to be, let's call it, growing teeth a little bit more. Is it an effective mechanism to withstand what's taking place with the alignment of those countries?
Well, yes and no. I think NATO is taking on certainly a lesser importance under the Trump presidency. I would, given the messaging and the behavior around Ukraine from Washington, I'd be really surprised that if Trump, if Putin attacked, say, a Baltic country, I'd be quite surprised to see America responding to an Article 5 on that one. So I think there's flaws there with NATO, and of course Turkey is a member of both the SCO and NATO.
Mhm.
So we have people inside the henhouse of NATO who are leaning, they're trying to play both sides, and that's absolutely what Erdogan's trying to do. Similar to the way that Modi in India is doing that. India deeply stung by Trump's sanctions against them.
Mhm.
They've been buying Russian oil on the black market, and they are clearly in need of allies, and they are prepared to forego their disagreements with China to stand on the stage and shake hands with President Xi. So, geopolitics is always a deeply complicated game, but NATO, I don't think, NATO is a defensive military alliance. Unless they're attacked, there's really not a huge role when it comes to countering something like the SCO, which is primarily a diplomatic organ.
So let's talk a little bit about how this affects Israel. Um, One, I know a number of our offices speak to their colleagues in both NATO and their respective parliaments about um, offering Israel non-member status at NATO. It's something I've had a couple of conversations about. What are your thoughts on that? And outside of NATO, what are some of the calculations that Israel must be considering dealing with the SEO?
So, in terms of Israeli sort of non-membership of NATO, something I would support. Clearly, CENTCOM and the IDF have been in total lockstep throughout the war that started on 7th of October 23. There is significant presence in Israel from the US Army, not least providing missile systems to help shoot down Iranian rockets whilst they were attacking Israel. Um, and that kind of ties us into how the SEO comes into this, because we saw, of course, Iran being represented in Tianjin, and that's a big deal, I think. China have significant financial links to the Iranians, as do Russia, particularly on the nuclear side of things. So, especially with the sensitivity surrounding Iranian nuclear status, having, other countries in this Chinese bloc making clear outreach to Tehran is a big deal, and that's something that will absolutely need to be monitored going forward.
I want to remind everybody you are welcome to submit questions to the chat or and Randy will put that into the link so everybody could submit their questions. I'm going to reference another quote you had from this article because I think it segues nicely into the next several questions. So you wrote, quote, "Here we see the second order effects of Israel's isolation on the world stage. The information war has captured the global south. For Jerusalem, this means that in future conflicts, the international stage will be more crowded with sympathetic voices for Tehran, backed indirectly by the SEO's diplomatic theater." I want to pull out the operative word in information war. To me, that's information. And you recently wrote about the killing of Abu Abeda. It was a fascinating article. If you could explain to everybody who Abu Abeda was and what did he create that to me was just absolutely brilliant, but diabolical. Um,
Mm.
and I think that is the information part of the information war. So let's start with Abu Ubaidah and what he developed.
So Abu Ubaidah was Hamas's head of information. A more accurate title might be head of propaganda. And Hamas have perfected something that I've called information maneuver, which is, where should I start here? Okay, so both the British and US armies work on something called the maneuverist approach, which is about shattering your enemy's will and cohesion. It's not necessarily about killing them or destroying them to the last soldier. It's about essentially breaking their will to fight you, using things like surprise and deception to kind of cognitively outthink the enemy. And I put forward the case in my recent Henry Jackson Society paper called Information Maneuver, the case that they have taken this into the information space. So they're trying to use information to break the will and cohesion of their enemies, be that the Israeli society, and we see that with the hostage videos, the way they're trying to turn the Israeli public against the war. We see that as they attack Israel's alliances and use information and propaganda to turn Israel's allies against Jerusalem. So they've had real tactical battlefield success with this information campaign. And I'd ask you to think of the 4-month pause between the Khan Yunis and Rafah operations between January and April 2024. That tactical pause came about through disinformation. The information campaign, All Eyes on Rafah, you may remember, convincing the world that there would be hundreds of thousands of casualties if Israel went in. Of course, that didn't turn out to be the case, but it did, through an information campaign, impose a 4-month pause on Israeli operations, which gave Hamas time to booby trap every other building in Rafah, to make sure they had their defensive positions set, and it enabled them to inflict significant casualties on the IDF that perhaps wouldn't have otherwise been inflicted had they not had that time to prepare. So it's about the very clever military use of information to enable you to have battlefields if not successes, certainly advantages. So Abu Ubaidah had a 1,500 strong combat camera team apparatus in his organization. Um, and I think the revelation of how many of these and how they operated gives us a great insight into this kind of accusation of 200 journalists being killed. Because what they did was every Hamas squad that went out had a journalist or a cameraman, or a propaganda operative, whatever you want to call them, attached to that squad, and it had a live feed back to their headquarters. So even if the cameraman was killed or the squad failed in their mission, the headquarters would still have footage that they could turn into something useful in the propaganda war and disseminate rapidly. Now, Hamas actually have more information warriors than their equivalent IDF unit. This is a really swept up media operation. And I would put it to you as a suggestion that a lot of these 200 journalists who were killed were, in fact, Hamas Abu Ubaidah propaganda operatives rather than the journalists that they're alleged to be. And it's a win-win-win for Hamas because if they don't get killed, they get great footage that they can then use against Israel. If they do get killed, then that's another journalist they can use to accuse Israel of war crimes with. So there's no lose here for them. And Abu Ubaidah, by all accounts, was the guy who oversaw the hostage release ceremonies, those absolute farces with the poor Bibas children being paraded in their coffins. That was all Abu Ubaidah's evil genius in terms of how to really twist the knife using information to try and attack their enemy, just as you would by firing artillery or bullets.
Yeah, the way you described the industrial sized propaganda machine that Abu Ubaidah created was so operationally complex that it's really hard to get your head around how sophisticated it was. So thankfully, he's no longer among the living. Uh, what is your assessment? How do you think that affects Hamas's ability to create and then disseminate false information?
Well, the teams that he had underneath him at the start of the war, certainly in the areas where Israel hasn't had that really enduring military presence, like Gaza City or central camps, Deir Balach area, there will be certainly camera teams in there who are still able to operate and still able to keep pumping out this information against Israel. What's interesting is that Hamas works on a very decentralized command structure. So when one commander gets killed, it doesn't actually have an enormous battlefield effect because somebody's always ready to step up. Now, it's not quite so clear who steps up in the place of Abu Ubaidah because he was, as I said, the evil genius, the puppet master behind this whole scheme. He did have deputies, but none of them was a very obvious kind of second in command figure who could step up and take over. So I'm going to be watching very closely over the coming weeks to see if there's any change in the way that Hamas is doing this, whether they do find someone who's capable of the level of wickedness that Abu Ubaidah is in terms of his planning, or whether there is a deterioration in the propaganda machine because they simply don't have anyone who's as good at this appalling manipulation of the media as Abu Ubaidah clearly was.
You just mentioned decentralized. Now you've written quite a bit trying to disabuse people of the idea of defeating Hamas entirely because it functions more like an Al Qaeda and other sort of Palestinianism. I think you were the word those organizations focused either on Islamism or Palestinianism rather than a state. So explain that a little farther if you can. Why do you think it's important that people move on from the idea of defeating Hamas in the way that you're addressing it?
Well, I think from a military perspective, I'd be semantics are important, and defeat and destroy have actually very different meanings in the military. So when you're doing military planning, you actually have a lexicon of words, and you select the word you want, and it gives your subordinates a very clear idea of what you mean. So if you say defeat, you probably mean degrade the enemy to kind of 50 to 60% of their original strength. When you say destroy, you mean wipe them off the battlefield. And that's it's the destroy piece that is so challenging to do in the case of an organization like Hamas. First of all they have to do not to be killed is to put their weapons down and blend into the civilian population. It's really easy if you're a Hamas fighter not to get killed. You just walk away. You're still Hamas. You still have evil, malign intent in your heart, but it's then very difficult for a legal army such as Israel is to then target you. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you have to understand how Muslim Brotherhood organizations work. And I would recommend anyone do some reading on the Muslim Brotherhood, and because they are the most insidious of organizations. They work from the ground up and they infest every aspect of life in the area that they want to take over, from judiciary through to administrators through to education systems. And Hamas has spent the last nearly 20 years putting their people in every key position that matters in Gaza. And that's why it's so difficult to weed them out, because if you then remove all of those administrators, you've got no one to administrate Gaza at all. And you have to find another mechanism of governance. Otherwise, you just have complete anarchy, and probably something even worse than Hamas will fill that void. We saw that in Iraq. We saw that in Afghanistan. These are lessons from our failures that Israel is certainly, I think, taking on board. When it comes to kind of people talk about we defeated Nazism as an idea in 1945, that's because Germany had a state army you could beat. You could put your boot on the German army's throat and force them to quit. Very hard to do that with an enemy like Hamas, who are quite happy to become martyrs. They're quite happy to die themselves. They're happy for their families to die. They're happy for Gazan civilians to die, because they are thinking in terms of degrading Israel's legitimacy on the international stage. They want to be Shahid. They want to go to Jannah and get their virgins, and also take their families with them, because their thinking is that by dying, they buy extra passes to Jannah for people around them. Um, and then on top of that, Hamas sits outside Gaza's borders. Hamas is not geographically confined to Gaza. They have military headquarters in Turkey. They have financial flows in their leadership in Qatar and Doha. They have a well-established presence in Lebanon. And at the moment in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, they're polling at 70 to 80% approval ratings. If there's an election in in Ramallah tomorrow, Hamas win it hands down. Um, and just last week, we saw an assassination plot against Ben Gvir foiled by Shin Bet that was headquartered in Turkey and run out of the West Bank. So this is really difficult, I think, for people to get their heads around, because you think you have a great army in the IDF, you have a very capable, well-armed, amazing intelligence, everything you would want your army to have, the IDF has it. You would think that destroying Hamas completely might be a reasonable thing for them to do, but actually it's far more complicated than that. And the reason this is important is because military force is a tool. It's not the end state. It's a tool to get you to a political end state. And to achieve a realistic political end state, you have to have an understanding of what can and cannot be achieved realistically by military force. And so if you're insisting on destroying Hamas, that's probably not going to happen. And that's probably then going to affect what your political goals are at the end of it. And ultimately, until you address the reason for Hamas, then you're going to have either Hamas continue to keep going, they might mutate into another group in the way that Al Qaeda and ISIS have, or you'll get something completely new stepping into the void. But they're still going to have that same aim of Palestinianism, which is an important phrase to define. Einat Wilf is the originator of this, but it's essentially the river to the sea. It's getting rid of the state of Israel and replacing it with a state of Palestine, rather than having parts of Judea and Samaria, parts of Gaza, all of both existing as a separate state alongside Israel in peace. It's the opposite of that. It's continual war and conflict until Israel is gone forever. Um, until you break that idea, it doesn't really matter if you destroy Hamas or not. You're still going to have people on Israel's borders who want her destroyed. So the political end state is critical here. How do you get around Palestinianism? That's not a military solution. That's a diplomatic solution, an economic solution underpinned by security provided by your military. So it's essentially, I think destroying Hamas is a very simple solution to a very complex problem. and simple solutions to complex problems are seldom the right one.
Hamas's polling in the West Bank is probably the reason there has been only one election in the last 20 years. And President Abbas is in his 20th or 21st year of a 4-year term. The risk is just too great. So let's sort of bring the different themes that we've had together here. And you're sort of touching on the political and I think the military engagement in Gaza City. No doubt the war in Gaza is fuel for the fire. And the protests throughout Europe and much of the world, the amplification of information through the SCO, it's very hard to promote information if there is no information to promote. And the idea that Hamas can be destroyed, which is often what precedes the idea that Israel should go into Gaza City. And you're on the record as opposing going into Gaza City. Now, they've already started a movement. The campaign started. They've destroyed a number of high rises. They control about 40% of Gaza City. What are the reasons you are opposed or were opposed to them going into Gaza City? And has anything changed at this stage for you? How do you look at it differently now?
Yeah, I mean, the opposed is probably the wrong idea. I think militarily it's a bad choice. I think, it's not for me to oppose or support. It's for me to look at and analyze. And for everything I've just said about how hard it is to destroy Hamas, look, let's just break it down into advantages and disadvantages. That's probably a very simple way to analyze it. The advantages are they can keep grinding through Hamas infrastructure, good thing. They can keep killing Hamas fighters and people like Abu Ubaidah, good thing. They can, show the Gazans that there is nowhere to hide if you are a Hamas fighter, also a good thing. The downsides, first of all, the big one for me is the hostages. I think if you back Hamas into a corner, then the fate of the hostages, I think, is certainly looking less positive than if you can find a way to come to some kind of deal with Hamas to release them. The next thing is, of course, Israel's isolation on the international stage. And when we talk about security, when we're talking about defense and international affairs, security can have a number of meanings. And one of the ways you provide security for a state is through alliances, through allies, through international cooperation that strengthens your bargaining position on the world stage. And that ties in nicely with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's what countries like Iran are doing, Russia are doing, Pakistan are doing. At the moment, Israel is looking very, very lonely on the international stage. Washington has stood firm, clearly. But I think Europe is almost a lost cause, certainly until the Gaza war ends. Hamas have managed to persuade numerous governments around the world, including Canada, UK, France, to ratify and acknowledge the state of Palestine. And indeed, we've got Abu Mazen in London this week. And unfortunately, rather than arrest him, he's being lauded at number 10 Downing Street by Keir Starmer, which frankly turns my stomach. But that is Mr. Starmer's decision, and it's based on the kind of negative perception of Israel and the positive perception of Palestine that has come out of 7th of October, which is absolutely insane if you think about it. How the side that perpetrated the massacre is now riding high in world opinion, and the side defending itself against the massacre is being condemned universally. And that brings us, and I think ties in the power of information maneuver. That's the success of Hamas's information campaign. And so by going into Gaza City, you're achieving relatively small tactical gains. You are putting the hostages at significant risk. You are furthering Israel's international isolation on the world stage. And I think if you do the cost-benefit analysis of that, I think the costs outweigh the benefits, given that I don't think it's possible to destroy Hamas completely for all the reasons I spent 5 minutes talking about a minute ago. So it's a cost-benefit analysis for me, and it still doesn't quite add up from where I'm sat.
I just want to make a distinction that Europe, is a lost cause. I mean, I think there's certainly tensions Western Europe. The Western European leaders are having some challenges. Kudos to Chancellor Merz on repeated occasions, standing up that he will not recognize Palestine state, supporting Israel. Giorgia Meloni, the same. Many, if not all, of the Central and Eastern European countries have really stood very closely with Israel. We have a lot of, obviously, most of our attendees are from the US. And the distinction often is lost because we over on this side of the pond tend to look at Europe as somewhat monolithic. It's
Yeah.
just one big country with one way of thinking and one way of doing things. But for our audience, I want to make sure the distinction is laid out. This is very, very different between a number of Western countries and those east of the vertical line from Berlin down. But point well taken about Gaza City and the challenges there. So if you were the prime minister of Israel, if you're not, so you can't, but if you were, what would be things that you'd be considering right now?
I think my number one priority would be the hostages and finding a way to get them released. Now, if I had the right answer to that, uh, then I'd be a miracle worker. I don't think there's an easy or correct solution. And I can't tell you definitively that I know exactly what Israel should do to get them home, but it would be my priority. I've seen the deal that Mr. Trump has been talking about, and really, I think people have to draw their own line. What's most important? Is it security through degrading as much of Hamas in Gaza as possible? Is it bringing the hostages home? Is it Israel standing on the international stage? And each person here will have their own opinion on which is the most important priority to them. Um, I have an emotional involvement. I'm friends with a number of hostage families. The last thing I would want to see is their loved ones not return home, those that are alive. So personally, that would be my position. Um, Look, how do you do that? You have to make a deal, and that it tastes awful. Like that is a nasty taste to have to make these deals with Hamas. But that is again, I've used the phrase a couple of times, the evil genius of what they did. Taking hostages has essentially hamstrung Israel's campaign. This would have been over a year ago, if not longer ago, if there weren't those hostages there. Um, you can also discuss whether it's appropriate to reward hostage taking with making a deal. What message does it send if you allow yourself to be extorted by terror groups? It means, I think, that you are then susceptible to that again in future, and we can draw a clear line from the hostage taking on 7th of October back to the Shalit deal. So there's all kinds of nuances and challenging things here, and as ever in the Middle East, I think what you're trying to find is the least worst option. There's not really any good options on the table here. It's like, what is the least worst? Which option is going to do the least harm? Is it going to be grinding through Gaza City? Does that do the least harm? Is it coming to a deal where you release potentially thousands of Palestinian prisoners back to potentially cause future harm to Israel further down the line? Is that the least worst? And really, that's where this hypothetical prime minister of Israel is going to have to make their decision. If it's me, I'd just do the classic army commander thing of asking for more intelligence first before committing to a definitive answer.
Thanks for the response. We're going to pause there for a word from our sponsor. And today, that word comes from me. And then we'll return and we'll take the questions that have been submitted. And this message, to be honest, is as much for me as it is for all of you, I think. In the long course of human events, good has always triumphed over evil. It hasn't been easy. There have been periods of real darkness, but the world has only gotten better for humankind over its history. And in the long 3,500-year history of the Jews have always triumphed. It hasn't been always easy. Been long periods of darkness. Israel has always triumphed. And while past performance is no guarantee of future performance, it's a pretty good trend to consider. Unfortunately, we all find it too easy to consume ourselves with current events and negative news. So let me be honest. Yes, it is really difficult out there. And I won't go through the litany of grievances we could level at the world. I don't want to go in that direction. I want to go in the other direction. Something we rarely feel and we would rarely use, optimism. And I want to start by invoking Viktor Frankl's well-known axiom, a person with a why can bear anyhow. In other words, the search, the action of searching and finding meaning leads to fulfillment, and more often leads to triumph than despair. And you can't find meaning, you can't find fulfillment without optimism. How can one find their why if they're not optimistic that there is a why to find? And I'm going to ask Andrew at the end of today's briefing to tell us something he's optimistic about, because I think it's important for all of us to hear why we should be optimistic. But I'm going to start. And yes, what I'm about to say is a little self-serving, but it has the added advantage of being true. I am optimistic that ELNET's work will continue to make profound inroads across Europe for Israel, so much so that Israel becomes indispensable to European interests. I'm confident ELNET's work identifies and empowers European allies that will help protect Israel against diplomatic pressures, because defense and economic cooperation are too important to risk. And I'm optimistic because each and every day I talk to donors or potential donors who are amazed, thrilled, and I dare I say relieved to learn about our successes. And because our profile is increasing, so too are the numbers of the people who are willing to join our mission. I'm going to assume that everyone on this call knows their why. Why does Israel matter? Why must Israel triumph? Why must we ensure Israel has relationships with key allies? If you know your why, then I hope you know ELNET is your how. That's why each and every one of you should be optimistic about our future. If you have invested in our work, I want to say thank you. If you are new to ELNET or you've not yet become a Diplomacy Club member, then be an optimist. Choose to be an optimist and become a Diplomacy Club member today. I want to say thank you for all you do. And now I'm going to get back to questions for Andrew. All right, Andrew, we have a question from Paul Wilder. Radical Islam already has a stronghold and entrenchment with England's areas and population, and will only get worse with their positioning within the British government. How and will Britain deal with this eventual takeover of Britain in time and before it becomes too late?
I mean, I don't think radical Islam is embedded in the government quite yet. I don't think they've reached that point. We do have 5 Gaza MPs, which is another great example of how disinformation can have a tangible effect on Israel's allies. They are still a minority, and the areas you're talking about, the actually radicalized Muslim population is perhaps not as high as some social media fever might have people believe. It is undoubtedly a question. The first step has to be 2 things: banning the Muslim Brotherhood and banning the IRGC. They would be the very first 2 things that I would do to address this problem, because actually it's the radicalization of our Muslim population that is the danger. And those 2 organizations are absolutely responsible for most of the radicalization that's going on. So banning those 2 things is a big deal. And then, getting control of our borders, I think, is the next most important thing for the UK. Far too many people are coming in. It's lowering everyone's living standards. And when those living standards are lowered, that's when those fault lines in society start to open up. I think if everyone's happy and affluent and, feels looked after properly by the state or the country they live in, that they're getting a fair deal, then these things become less important. Once we've got a grip of the actual borders, I think we need to get a grip of the immigration process, where people have to integrate. And I think Denmark have done a really good job of this. They've shown the pathway to proper integration of multicultural populations. It's not perfect, nothing ever is. But for example, people should not get benefits if they don't speak a British language. English ideally, but if they want to speak Welsh or Gaelic, then I would firmly encourage them as a Welshman to go and learn how to speak Welsh, but it needs to be a British language. And, don't allow new populations to all settle in the same place. Insist that they live elsewhere. And once you've got this flow under control, those people that you do allow in, insist that they live amongst the existing population so they don't form enclaves and stuff like that. So there's a number of things we can do. I don't think it's a lost cause by any stretch of the imagination, but it does need a change of government before we even think to start about a solution to this.
And Andrew, there's a yes and there, because you talked about the Red-Green Alliance. just a moment ago. Red being neo-Marxists, the nihilists, all the leftists or
Yeah.
isms, and the green being Islamism. So Islamism represents one half of that coin, but I don't even know it's a full half. In England or the UK, it's what, 8% are Muslim. Not all of that are Islamists.
Mm.
Obviously, they present a problem. Could you talk about the issues then on the other side of that coin? Because that seems to be where a lot of this pressure is coming from.
It is, but again, the far left never really make electoral gains in the UK. We occasionally get the odd rabble-rousing far left winger get through to Parliament. People like Jeremy Corbyn or Tony Benn, uh, but they're always a minority fringe in the UK. We've never really seen a kind of popular movement. And even when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, that was effectively a coup of the Labour Party by a fringe minority. So Labour changed their leader election rules so that anyone could join for £5. And you got a raft of people join and vote Jeremy Corbyn through. And effectively, he was like a tumour in the Labour Party. I don't think he was a fair reflection of the average Labour Party member. And I've got friends who are in Labour and they're perfectly decent people. We don't agree on economics, but it doesn't mean they're bad people. Whereas the far left really are bad people with some terrible ideas that, if implemented, will cause the same amount of suffering as communism always does when it's implemented. So, but I think they're a minority fringe. They just make an awful lot of noise. And you spoke about being anti-West. It's exactly that. We call it the omni cause. It doesn't matter if it's the environment. It doesn't matter if it's Israel. It doesn't matter, what they're upset at. The trans rights issue. It seems to be they same old people, same old faces at these protests. Um, Palestine Action were banned. They're getting maybe 1,500 people, 1,000 people turning out. In a population of 69 million, it's a very, very small percentage. So, yes, it's a problem. Is it a massive problem? No, I don't think so.
Harold Eisenman would like to know what your thoughts are about Israel's relationship with Syria, the changing circumstances up there, and what are your thoughts on future relations? And I'll add Lebanon to that one. Let's look at Lebanon and Syria.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating moves at the moment. The withdrawal of UNIFIL. We'll start with Lebanon. The withdrawal of UNIFIL next year is going to be a very interesting one to keep an eye on. Whether anything American replaces UNIFIL, I think we're still waiting to see. But I speak to people I know in the Pentagon, and I know they're certainly looking at these options. Um, can the Lebanese government take advantage of a weakened Hezbollah? That's the $60,000 question. Are they in a position where they can put Hezbollah right back in their box for good, or is this going to be something that rears its head in 10, 15 years time? That's the decisive issue in Lebanon, I think. When we look at Syria, I think we can't disambiguate it from Turkey at this point. My biggest fear when the Shia crescent of Iran collapsed was that it would be replaced by a Muslim Brotherhood Sunni crescent. And there's certainly indications that Qatari money is flowing that way. There's certainly unquestionably Turkish military involvement in Syria. HTS, which is Al-Shara's party. Um, are you guys calling him Jelani or Al-Shara? What's the common American before I go forward?
It depends who you're talking to.
Okay,
If
so
someone sort of is leaning in his favor, they'll call him Al Shara. If they still have their skepticism, it's Al Jalani.
okay, fair enough. Well,
The name they use is indicative of how they think of the man.
understandable. It's not for me because I just use Al-Shara because it's the common parlance in over here. Um, I am still highly skeptical of him. We've seen what happened with the Druze, and we saw what happened on the coast with the Alawites. And there's one of two things here: either he doesn't have control of the crazies that work for him, or he tacitly approves of what those crazies are doing. And neither of those are really good options. Turkey, HTS had clear links in the past. They had a bit of a falling out. You have the Syrian National Army, which is basically a Turkish proxy force. They're the ones attacking the Kurds. It's still a mess. It's still potentially a jihadi basket case waiting to happen. I'm very skeptical of them joining the Abraham Accords anytime soon. I know Mr. Trump is very keen to get people to sign up to that. It still feels way too soon to have lifted sanctions and start bringing Syria back into the diplomatic fold. So I would like to see a bit more of a wait and see approach for Syria before we make any substantive moves.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to ask my last question of you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom Flesch, ELNET's chair. I think he also has a question, but we'll say the closing remarks. So, all right, Andrew, you wouldn't be doing this if you weren't optimistic, because that's the reason why we pursue anything we care about. So, what are you optimistic about?
The silent majority. I think when we look at social media, when we look at protests in London, it's always the extremes that make the most noise. I'm optimistic that the vast majority of people, particularly in the UK, are good and decent and not anti-Semitic and actually find what's happening. Obviously, they're upset by the war in Gaza because it's human suffering and misery, but they're not so invested that they are going to go down this anti-Semitic rabbit hole. And I think there is huge potential untapped in the silent majority to restore the kind of equilibrium to our society that we seem to need at the moment. So silent majority is what I'm optimistic about.
Well, for an organization that works with political influencers and policy influencers that have the ear of the silent majority, that's good to hear. It's reason for us to be optimistic as well. So thank you for joining us, Andrew. Really appreciate it. Tom, I'd like to introduce you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Mark, you did a wonderful job today with this interview. And Andrew, it's always a pleasure having you and hearing your insights. But I have to tell you, I was thinking about making a comment other than just the closing. And I must admit, you just threw me right off with your optimism, the silent majority, which I, in my heart, believe that is what will, in the end, rise and combat all this anti-Semitism, anti-democracies, anti-freedom of choice, and of all those things. And I agree with you, and I'm hopeful. And I don't know when the silent majority starts becoming not the silent majority, but sooner is the better. But I like to keep this all as simple as possible. And it's very difficult because it's a very complex issue. The Muslim Brotherhood or radical Islam, their ambitions are not just clearly defined, other than they want to dominate the world. And if it starts with Israel, it doesn't end with Israel. We saw that in World War II. And for anyone that thinks that it stops there, it won't. It will continue on, and it will go to and spread to all the freedom, democracy, freedom-loving people around the world. And to me, it's a very, very, very big issue, and people should not be fooled that is contained to Israel. And too much of the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel, anti-Jew remarks that we're hearing now, we've seen in the past. And during World War II, we saw it in the most egregious way. And it should not be, history may not repeat itself, but it sure does resemble itself. And so I feel that what you're saying and what you're doing, we're so thankful and so appreciative that you come on this broadcast and speak to our viewing and listening audience. And it just brings so much insight into the issue. So look, I just also want to say that, Mark, we have a history of resilience. And
Tom, you went on mute.
And Mark, we have a history of resilience, thousands of years of resilience. And I don't see why it will ever stop now. And so it might be terrible, destructive, huge prices to pay. But in the end, I feel very optimistic that in accordance with our tradition, we will be resilient, we will continue to be resilient, and we will matter. So, gosh, just if it wasn't for Israel, if the Jews didn't have the homeland of Israel, what that could have been, where we could be today. Well, we wouldn't be in this position because we've never gotten this far. But I just want to say, I'm not going to be with the group next Monday. So I want to take this opportunity to wish everyone a new year, Lashana Tova, a new year filled with goodness in every possible way for everybody. All freedom-loving people, democracies, the Jewish people, the land of Israel, all goodness for all those who have a common goal in life, and that is to make things better for each other. And I know, and I'm optimistic that we will. So with that thought, I just want to say to you again, Hoshana Tova, thank you all so very much, and we appreciate your tuning in. And Mark, let's start the new year by soliciting everybody to help us keep our good work going. And please make a contribution. Make it a New Year's oath just to help support the work we're doing, because I will tell you, Europe is a difficult battle to fight, because I don't know that the Europeans really appreciate what their conflicts of which way, who to support, how to support, which way they're going. They have their own demographics to deal with, but we're in this together and we stay together. And ELNET is the most important organization in Europe fighting for the relationships, European relationships with Israel, and God willing, we will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew, when you make it to this side of the pond, will you please let us know?
Yeah, absolutely will do. I'd love to see you. So
Yeah,
let's keep in touch.
that'd be great. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week. And thank you again for joining us.